right, everyone, welcome back. I am so excited for today's deep dive.
Me too. Yeah, this is a good one.
We're looking at Syria. You know, it's been in the news for so long, and we're always hearing about, the conflict and the humanitarian crisis,
Right, right.
and it's heartbreaking. But um, today we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and look at something really, really cool,
Absolutely.
and I think hopeful.
Yeah.
This is a workshop that happened just recently, actually on February 8th.
Oh, wow. So this is very recent.
Yeah.
Very fresh.
It was called A New Vision for Syria in the Context of Diversity.
Okay.
And this workshop brought together a bunch of Syrian activists, researchers, experts, folks who are really thinking deeply about what the future of Syria could look like.
That's fantastic. I mean, to have that kind of gathering, especially, given the situation in Syria, must have been quite an event.
Yeah, and it's not just, theoretical folks sitting around talking about ideas.
Right.
I mean, these are people who are actively involved in trying to shape the future of their country.
Wow.
It's very, very cool.
Yeah.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting is the group that put this workshop together is called the Syrian Monitor for Human Rights.
Okay.
And I don't know if you're familiar with them.
I am. Yeah, they're doing some really important work, especially when it comes to advocating for the rights of minorities in Syria and really highlighting the situation of groups that are often overlooked.
Yeah, and they've been, really vocal about the situation of Assyrians, Syriacs in particular,
Yeah.
who are a Christian minority group in Syria.
Right.
And they've also been working to protect other minority groups as well.
Mm-hmm.
So they're really coming at this from a perspective of inclusivity and diversity.
That's really important because so much of the conflict in Syria has been driven by these divisions between different groups.
Yeah.
And to have an organization that's really trying to bridge those divides and focus on the commonalities is really essential for any kind of hope for a peaceful future.
Yeah, and one of the things that they said in the final statement that they put out from this workshop that I thought was so powerful
Okay.
was that Syria's diverse cultures and ethnicities should be seen as a strength, not a weakness, and could actually be the foundation for a stable and prosperous future.
That's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah.
Because I think so often when we think about diversity in the context of conflict, we see it as a source of division.
Right.
Right? And something that kind of makes it more difficult to find peace.
Yeah.
But they're saying, no, actually, this diversity is something that can be a source of strength if we kind of harness it in the right way.
Yeah, and they're not shying away from the fact that there are these different groups in Syria.
Yeah.
Right. They specifically mentioned Assyrians, Syriacs,
Mm-hmm.
Kurds, Arabs, other minority groups.
Right.
And they're saying, we need to find a way to create a future where all of these groups can live together peacefully.
Right. And where their rights are respected and where they feel like they belong.
Yeah, so the question is, okay,
Yeah. How do they actually propose to do that?
how do you actually put this into practice?
Right. What are the concrete steps?
And I think that's where it gets really interesting because they came up with some very specific recommendations
Okay, cool.
from this workshop.
I'm really curious to hear what they are.
Yeah, so the first one was about creating a democratic and secular state.
Okay.
And I think this is huge, right? Because for so long, Syria has been ruled by a very authoritarian regime,
Mm-hmm.
and there's been a lot of tension between different religious groups as well.
Right. And so to have a system where everyone's voices are heard and where religion doesn't play a dominant role in politics, that's a big shift.
Yeah, and they don't really go into detail in the final statement about exactly how they would envision this happening.
Sure.
But I think the fact that they're even putting it out there
Right.
as a goal is really significant.
Absolutely. It's a starting point for a conversation.
Yeah.
And it sets a vision for a different kind of future.
Exactly. For Syria. And it's something that I think a lot of people in Syria would really resonate with.
I would imagine so, yeah.
The second recommendation that they made was about ensuring equality and human rights for all.
Okay.
So this is about really enshrining in law the idea that everyone is equal.
Right. Regardless of their ethnicity, their religion, their gender, their sexual orientation, any kind of characteristic that might make them a target of discrimination.
Yeah, and this is something that has been sorely lacking in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot of persecution of minority groups.
Absolutely.
And so this is really about, saying we need to have laws in place that protect everyone.
Right.
And that ensure that everyone has equal access to opportunities.
Yeah. And this is something that I think is also really important for preventing future conflict.
Absolutely.
Because if people feel like they're being treated unfairly, if
Right.
they feel like their rights are being violated, that's going to breed resentment.
Mm-hmm.
And that can easily escalate into violence.
Yeah, so this is really about, creating a more just and equitable society. So it was
Exactly.
essential for peace.
Absolutely.
The third recommendation that they made was about promoting dialogue and cooperation between different groups.
Okay.
And I think this is so critical because, we've seen how the lack of communication and understanding between different groups can really fuel conflict.
Right. It creates suspicion, it creates fear, and it makes it much harder to find common ground.
Yeah. And so they're saying, we need to create spaces
Yeah.
where people from different backgrounds can come together and talk to each other,
Right.
get to know each other.
And build relationships.
Yeah, and build trust and,
Yeah.
and understand each other's perspectives.
Right. Because often the things that divide us are not as big as we think they are,
Right.
but it's the lack of communication that makes them seem insurmountable.
Exactly. And I think this is something that, it sounds so simple,
Right.
but it could be so difficult to do in practice,
It is difficult, yeah, but it's so essential.
especially in a place like Syria, where there's been so much violence and trauma.
Right, where people have been hurt so deeply by other groups.
Yeah.
It's hard to overcome that history, but it's not impossible.
Yeah. And when I was reading these recommendations, I was thinking about other countries that have gone through similar challenges. Like South Africa, for example.
Yeah.
After apartheid,
Right.
they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was really about bringing people together to talk about the past.
Right, to acknowledge the wrongs that had been committed.
Yeah, to acknowledge the pain and to try to find a way to move forward together.
Right.
And it was a very imperfect process.
Sure.
But I think it was a really important step in terms of healing and reconciliation.
Absolutely, and it showed the power of dialogue,
Yeah.
even in the face of really deep divisions.
Yeah. And it makes me wonder, could something like that work in Syria?
I think it's worth exploring.
Could you have some kind of process where people could come together and really talk about what happened?
Right, and start to rebuild trust.
Yeah.
Because without trust, it's going to be very difficult to move forward as a society.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so hopeful about this workshop is that it's really focused on that idea of dialogue.
Right.
And bringing people together.
And it's also interesting that it took place in Sweden.
Oh, yeah? Why is that?
Well, specifically in Södertälje,
Okay.
which has a very large Syriac diaspora community.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so it's kind of giving them a voice in shaping the future of their homeland.
Even though they're not living there currently?
Exactly.
That's really powerful.
Yeah, and it also shows the potential role that the diaspora can play in peace-building efforts.
So what do you think?
Well, I think this workshop is a really encouraging sign.
Yeah.
It's a small step,
Sure.
but it's a step in the right direction. And it shows that there are people who are committed to creating a different kind of future for Syria.
Yeah.
A future that's based on inclusivity and dialogue and respect for human rights.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we can all support.
Absolutely.
Regardless of our background or our beliefs.
I think the idea of a more peaceful, just Syria is something that appeals to everyone.
Yeah, and I think this workshop really gives us some concrete ideas about how to make that happen.
Right. It's not just a vague hope.
Yeah.
It's a set of recommendations that could actually be implemented.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that even in the midst of all the darkness, there is still hope.
There are people working for peace.
Yeah, and there are people who are willing to come together and
Right.
work towards a better future.
Yeah,
And I think that's something that we should all be celebrating.
absolutely.
So that's our deep dive for today.
Yeah, great deep dive.
We encourage you to learn more about the Assyrian Monitor for Human Rights and
Yeah.
the work that they're doing.
They're doing some really fantastic work.
And really think about what a truly inclusive Syria might look like.
Right.
What would it take to create a society where everyone feels like they belong?
Yeah, that's a great question to leave our listeners with.
Yeah, and how can we all play a role in making that happen?
Yeah, because ultimately peace building is not just something that happens overseas. It's
Right.
something that we can all contribute to
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
our own communities.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.
This is a great conversation.
It was great, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
All right, see you later. Bye. 26-6.